Thank you very much. And that concludes general questions, and we now move to questions to the First Minister. Question 1, Joanne Lamont.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what engagements he has planned for the rest of the day.
First Minister.
Deputy Presiding Officer, I'd like to say a few words of tribute to Peter Fraser, who died sadly last weekend. I mean, Lord Fraser was never a member of this chamber, but he did us significant service in the Holyrood inquiry, and before that, obviously, as a distinguished Lord Advocate for Scotland. More recently, he agreed to serve as an independent advisor to the Scottish Government on the Ministerial Code, another public service he performed without fee or favour or any remuneration whatsoever. Scottish public life is much poorer for his passing. I know all our thoughts across this chamber, colleagues and friends, are with his wife Fiona and their family at this sad time.
Thank you very much. Joanne Lamont.
And can I agree with everything the First Minister has said and pass our condolences to the family of Peter Fraser and recognise the contribution, the very significant contribution he made to the public life of Scotland. John Swinney says the choice for Scotland is between austerity and independence. Can the First Minister explain how a separate Scotland could possibly have a different economic policy from the rest of the United Kingdom when they would be the ones deciding what we could spend, what we could borrow, what our interest rates and taxation would be, without any representation at all?
Minister.
Well, there's a difference between fiscal policy and monetary policy. As John Swinney has pointed out many times, and so I'll repeat it for Joanne Lamont's benefit, if we take the last year for what figures are available, there was a relative surplus of over £4 billion between Scotland and comparison with the rest of the UK. That £4 billion, a substantial sum, could have been used in a number of ways to record more investment in the Scottish economy towards recovery, to borrow less, which would be probably a good idea, but that stronger fiscal position could be put to the worth and benefit of the Scottish people. In terms of the choice now between continued austerity and that prospect of mobilising the resources of Scotland, well, that now is crystal clear, of course, because in the last few weeks, the Labour Party have decided to accept the social welfare policies of the Conservative Party, and last week decided to accept the economic policies of the Conservative Party. So after generations of trying to find any group in Scotland, the Tory party have finally found their economic ally in the leadership of the Labour Party in Scotland.
Thank you. Joanne Lamont.
Like most of what the First Minister says in his chamber now, that is completely ludicrous. He is... And just because this is the man who calls it a relative surplus, it's a deficit. He says there's a distinction between fiscal and monetary policy, but his own adviser, John Kay, makes the point that in independent Scotland, these circumstances, the rest of the United Kingdom would seek extensive fiscal oversight over the management of the Scottish economy and would be unwilling to concede analogous oversight from Scotland over the fiscal and other policies of the UK. The First Minister needs to get serious. For the fact of the matter is this. The First Minister plans even greater austerity in an independent Scotland. That is why, well, Mike Russell thinks it's silly. However, it is his First Minister's policy. It is his government's policy. He is planning a 3% cut in corporation tax for bankers and big business. That will cost, in the real world, that will cost us £385 million each and every year. According to Spice, that is the equivalent of 7,000 jobs each and every year. When the First Minister says he doesn't like George Osborne's economics, isn't that because he thinks he hasn't gone far enough and his plan is to cut taxes deeper than the Tories?
First Minister.
Can I just deal with that? And we've already published an analysis on the impact of a competitive corporation tax policy in Scotland. It would increase the level of gross domestic product in Scotland by 1.4%. That's a substantial amount. Increase employment in Scotland by 27,000 jobs and increase total tax revenues, because when you enlarge the economy, you draw in more taxes across the tax base. But can we return to whether or not the Labour Party is now adopting wholesale Tory economic policies? Joanne Lamont seems to deny this as if it hadn't happened. This is the major development in politics over the last few weeks. The Labour Party High Command in London have decided to adopt the Conservative Party's economic budgetary approach. This has been said by Ed Miliband and Ed Balls. Now, I can understand that Joanne Lamont wasn't consulted in advance, but not to know about it 10 days after it's happened seems totally extraordinary. So let's be absolutely clear. After a generation of the Conservative Party trying to find any significant body of opinion in Scottish society to agree with their policies, they finally found their true allies in the Labour Party.
Joanne Lamont.
Obviously, the First Minister doesn't understand his own policy, because you remember this great radical policy that he has got. Professor Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel laureate, his advisor said, "Some of you have been told that lowering tax rates on corporations will lead to more investment. The fact is that's not true. It is just a gift to the corporations, increasing inequality in our society." For the First Minister, this is a pretence and a game. But in the real world, his plans involve cutting jobs in the Scottish economy at the very point when we need them more. Because if we look at the First Minister's corporation, only the First Minister could take £385 million out of the Scottish economy and say it won't affect anything. The rest of us know that it will have a direct impact on services. He says over 20 years his tax cut for big business would create 1,350 jobs a year, and the economy would grow at a massive 0.07% a year. And what would the cost of that be? We would, over that period, having given bankers and big business a £7.7 billion tax break, costing the equivalent of 140,000 jobs. Only in the First Minister's mind can that possibly be a credible policy. That is the kind of Reaganomics even the Tories don't believe in. Isn't it the case? Isn't it the case? You should do the sum and work it out. Isn't it the case that Alex Salmond said Scots don't mind Margaret Thatcher's economics, and what he wants is to apply her economics to an independent Scotland?
First Minister.
We have cut corporation tax twice, and I want to go further. We will reduce the tax again when we're able. Gordon Brown's first speech to the Institute of Directors as Prime Minister. Now, I know, of course, that Gordon Brown is only the leader of the Labour No campaign, and his friend and ally Alistair Darling, who, remember, wanted cuts which were deeper and tougher than those of Margaret Thatcher, leads the Tory Labour No campaign. But the things we published on the increase in GDP, on 27,000 jobs, is a significant amount, and an increase, that is an increase in total tax revenues, are the information which we presented to the public. Now, if Joanne Lamont has a different analysis, then she should present it. But if it is the case, as we put forward, well, no, what we've had is asking what the impact will be. The Scottish Government have published an analysis. If the Labour Party have a different analysis, then let them publish it.
Mr. MacDonald.
But if it is the case that this policy will result in an increase in employment, an increase in investment, an increase in GDP and an increase in total tax revenues, then even the Labour Party should think this is an excellent idea. Now, in terms of the extraordinary alliance that's developed between the Conservatives and the Labour Party, can I congratulate Joanne Lamont in writing the Chancellor's speech? One of his key points yesterday was to bemoan and to attack the something-for-nothing society. It's now not just the policy programme that the Labour Party have adopted wholesale. The Tories are now adopting Joanne Lamont's language as they seek to persuade people that austerity, continued austerity in the UK economy is something worth voting for. The shift of the Labour Party onto Tory ground is not just a fundamental mistake, it's a lesson for the Scottish people that the Unionist parties, Tory, Labour, Labour-Tory, offer nothing but continued austerity. What is offered by an independent Scotland is investment, progress and social justice in this society.
Joanne Lamont.
Well, I'm proud to say that on this side, we do not agree with the First Minister when he wants to give something for nothing to big business at the expense of jobs. And I have to say, 27,000 jobs pales in insignificance as apart from the 140,000 jobs that would be lost. And if we have a choice, between the analysis of the First Minister, given his record with arithmetic, and the analysis of Spice and Professor Stiglitz, I know what side I'm on, and his choice is one that will be deeply damaging to the people of this country. The fact of the matter is, the First Minister's credibility is like his EU advice. He will go to the ends of the earth to protect it, but we all know it doesn't exist. The man who backed the plans that broke the RBS now asks us to trust an economic vision. Well, I'm glad you think it is funny that a the First Minister used his office to encourage Fred Goodwin to do precisely that. So he is asking us to trust an economic vision which looks more like a hallucination. In private, we know that the First Minister and his colleagues know a separate Scotland would have huge economic problems. They, in private, even question the affordability of the pension. But in public, they think they can treat the people of Scotland like mugs. No promise. Do you know, in the real world, everybody understands there's a real challenge here and we need to protect ordinary people. You're too interested. The First Minister and his gang behind him are too interested in prosecuting a case they have believed all of their political lives to look at the consequences of their proposals for ordinary working people.
A little bit of calm, please.
And the fact is, all of them in public, no matter what they say in private, think they can treat the people of Scotland like mugs. No promise too nonsensical, and none needs to be costed. The fact of the matter is, from the First Minister, his Finance Secretary down, they say anything,
Mr. Stevenson.
Anything without ever doing the hard job of proving how these things would actually be delivered. Isn't it the case that the First Minister, Isn't it the case? Now, your own backbenchers are never going to say this to you, so let me answer this. This is what ordinary people believe. The First Minister must be daft for believing the people of Scotland might be daft enough to believe his independence plan.
Minister.
Well, before Joanne Lamont totally lost the plot entirely in that question, she actually said something I want to pick up. She said that she felt that 27,000 jobs paled into insignificance, as she put it. Now, that is a net job increase. That is the net increase of 27,000 jobs. And I just want people around this chamber and people around Scotland, the Labour Party leader is now reduced to saying that an increase of 27,000 jobs, in her words, is insignificant. The people of Scotland believe that 27,000 jobs is of great significance at the present moment. Now, I know it's embarrassing for the Labour Party to get pointed out in this chamber that the London leadership have decided to adopt wholesale the policies of George Osborne. But let's remember, when Joanne Lamont talked about a something-for-nothing society, she wasn't talking about corporation tax. She was talking about taking people's bus passes away. She was talking about tuition fees for students. She was talking about free personal care. She was talking about reversing all of the great social gains that this Parliament has delivered for the people of Scotland. And finally, I note that you think the folk here are a gang. Can I just point out to Joanne Lamont that after Aberdeen Donside, this gang's bigger than your gang.
There we are. Question 2, Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I would like to add the tributes of myself and of my party to those paid by the First Minister following the death of Peter Fraser. As a Member of Parliament, of Government and in his contribution to the law, he was a committed public servant. We feel his loss and our thoughts are with Fiona and his family at this time. Could I also ask the First Minister when he will next meet the Secretary of State for Scotland?
I have no plans to meet the Secretary of State in the near future.
Ruth Davidson.
2 weeks ago, I asked the First Minister about the scandal of vulnerable and desperately ill people having to pay for care that they should have received for free. This week, the Scottish Government announced a review into whether people are being denied funding for continuing health care. I welcome this, especially as new official figures show that the number of people receiving NHS funding for continuing care is down 37% in the last 4 years. However, we still do not know how many people have been affected and how much money they have had to spend. Can the First Minister tell us what work the Scottish Government is undertaking to establish the true extent of this issue?
First Minister.
Well, as Ruth Davidson rightly says, Alec Neil has instigated the independent review to ensure eligibility for NUS continuing health care is being appropriately and consistently applied across Scotland. The review will be led by Dr Ian Anderson, a very distinguished physician, past President of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Glasgow. The review will assess whether guidance is followed, a consistent approach is being taken across Scotland, assess whether improvements are needed to raise awareness of NUS continuing health care among professionals and consider whether an independent appeals process is required. I think that is a substantial step by the Health Secretary, and that will enable us to make absolutely sure that all patients in Scotland are getting the help and assistance to which they're entitled.
Ruth Davidson.
Deputy Presiding Officer, I asked the First Minister how many people and how much money. And while his answer talked of the very welcome review, which will look at the administration in the future, that will do nothing to help those affected in the past, including at least one family which was forced to sell their mother's house to pay for her care when it likely should have been covered by the NHS. 2 weeks ago, I asked the First Minister to institute a full audit of each health board to find the people affected so that we could right this wrong. He failed to answer. The Scottish Government's position is that anyone who feels that they may have been wrongly charged for their continuing care should come forward. But surely the First Minister has to appreciate that many of those affected will be among those least able in society to do so. They are people with complex care needs. Many will be residents in nursing homes. Some may be deceased, and it's simply not good enough for the government to put the onus on them or their surviving relatives, if they have any. This is a systemic failure, and this government needs to fix it. The First Minister has already moved on this issue by announcing the review that he has. Will he now commit to taking the further proactive steps that are needed in order to identify those potentially hundreds of ill and infirm people who've been forced to pay for care that should have been covered by our NHS?
First Minister.
Can I caution Ruth Davidson on a number of aspects of this? I think the steps that the government taken are good steps because we're going to fulfil Alec Neil's pledge to make sure that everyone in Scotland who's entitled to continued care in the National Health Service receives it properly. But can I just remind her that every single patient is currently assessed? When Ruth Davidson asks these questions, as she did previously, she seems to forget that each patient is currently assessed. and the assessment is what is being reviewed to make sure it's consistently applied across the health boards. Around 72 individuals have contacted the Scottish Government since the publicity on this issue, and each and every one of these cases is being personally examined to see if there's been any misapplication. But the other thing I'd point out to Ruth Davidson is that it's a fundamental difference in a country and a society which has free personal care than one which doesn't, because there can be many patients. For example, I think 3/4 of people receiving continuing care are in hospital. And whether they were defined as being eligible for continuing care or not, it wouldn't affect the care that they're currently receiving, because they're in hospital being in care in that fashion. So there's a fundamental difference between a society which has free personal care and one which doesn't, in terms of how people are categorised and the necessity for people being categorised to get the benefits to which they're entitled. Another example would be we separately classify NHS long-stay care in Scotland. And over the same period where there's been a reduction in NHS continuing care, long-stay care has increased from 488 to 562. It's a balance of opinion how people are categorised in these categories within the Scottish Health Service. And that's why I think, rather than jumping to conclusions and talking about hundreds, or she did in her press statement yesterday, thousands of cases, I think we should allow Dr Ian Anderson to review this to make sure that this is being applied consistently and appropriately across Scotland, and then act on his recommendations and results. But let's remember that every single case is assessed at the present moment. And also remember, there are 77,000 vulnerable older people in Scotland who have the benefits of a society with free personal care.
Thank you. Constituent supplementary, Mike Mackenzie, briefly, please.
Does the First Minister agree that the UK Government announcement this morning that there will be a specific islands contracts for difference rate is very good news for our islands, for Scotland and for the UK, which will benefit from significant generation capacity of our islands, and that credit is due to all of our Highlands and Islands MSPs, to our island councils and to the Scottish Government, who have worked together and campaigned for years on this important issue?
First Minister.
Well, it's been a huge and consistent theme throughout this administration in 2007 to get justice for the islands in terms of connection charges. I think it's certainly a tribute to the island councils and to local MSPs. I think this chamber should record its thanks to Fergus Ewing, who proposed the joint study group with the UK Government, which has come up with a proposal to rectify this wrong. The one caution I would have at this stage, this is just a commitment in principle. There is no detail at this stage. We don't know if it's going to be the same contract for difference for each island or one for the island authorities. But nonetheless, this is progress, important progress, because the island communities of Scotland have massive renewable energy potential. And to unlock that potential, one of the key aspects is to make sure that's recognised within the energy pricing system. That has been accepted in principle today, and I look forward to further cooperation with DEC and the London departments in order to make sure that's brought into reality. But I agree with Mike Mackenzie, this is good news for our island communities.
Briefly, Hugh Henry, please.
Officer, you will be aware of claims this week by a former senior examiner that the higher maths paper has been dumbed down. Previously, the team of senior examiners in higher maths resigned. These people know the higher maths paper better than any bureaucrat or politician. Pupils, their families and teachers need to be assured of the integrity of higher maths. Will the First Minister order an investigation into what is going on with higher maths?
First Minister.
Well, if the member would remember that, as I recall the controversy last year, it was because the paper was too difficult, as opposed to the paper being, as he puts it, dumbed down. I think we should hesitate before we suggest that the significant and welcome increase in the pass rates of not just higher maths but across the range of examinable subjects is due to anything other than the excellent performance of our pupils and the wonderful assistance of our teaching fraternity.
Thank you. Question 3, John Mason.
To ask the First Minister what effect the 2015-16 spending review will have on the Scottish Government's budget.
First Minister.
Well, the spending plans announced yesterday by the Chancellor means that in 2015-16, Scotland's DEL budget will reduce by a further £333 million in real terms compared to 2014-15, excluding the financial transactions, the loan finance, which of course requires to be repaid to the Exchequer. That's a hugely challenging position. It means that over the period 2010 to 11 to 2015-16, the real-term reductions to the Scottish Government's fiscal resource DEL of 8.9% and the conventional capital DEL budget of 26.6%. Over that period, a real terms decrease in total of 8.9% for resource and for capital 26.6%. These are sobering figures and indicates the extraordinary nature of the financial straitjacket that austerity from Westminster places this administration and Scotland in.
John Mason.
I wonder if the First Minister agrees that the Chancellor is attempting to hide the capital budget cuts with loans, but Scotland will have to pay them back in due course, and that is fooling nobody. And does he further agree that the referendum next year offers Scotland the chance to choose a fairer future, free of Westminster's damaging economic policies that threaten this country's recovery?
First Minister, briefly,
yes,
please.
I think John Mason's right on the button in terms of how he expresses it. Can I just point out that this question of what has been announced for 2 years' time, both the financial transactions which require to be repaid and the availability for the first time for this Parliament of access to borrowing powers, and these being lumped together as if they were free gratis gifts from the munificence of the Westminster Treasury. The first is money that has to be paid back. The second is money that has to be borrowed, and it's in 2 years' time. And to have David Mundell on Newsnight Scotland last night demand that this money to be borrowed for 2 years' time should be immediately used this year in the Scottish economy actually defies belief. I have to say that I advise people to have a look at Gordon Brewer's demolition of David Mundell last night to indicate the total transparent nature of the Tory and Labour plans for continued austerity in Scotland.
Thank you. Question 4, Roderick Campbell.
To ask the First Minister what economic benefits a direct air link to China would bring to Scotland.
Minister.
Well, this is a matter of huge potential. Over a 5-year period, the net present value of a direct air link to China has been assessed at £41 million, which would be a boost for tourism trade with one of the world's fastest growing economies. The European External Relations Committee highlighted that a direct link would be of substantial assistance in the development of Scotland's business trade with China, as well as helping Scotland to be more of a tourist destination for the Chinese market. And this week, the Minister for External Affairs has held constructive talks with the Civil Aviation Administration of China in Beijing, where all parties reiterated our desire to see progress made.
Mr Campbell.
I welcome the Government's ongoing commitment towards establishing a direct air link with China. Does the First Minister agree with me that a substantial barrier to securing new international routes and indeed protecting existing domestic links is the UK Government's punitive approach to air passenger duty?
First Minister. Well, it is, of course, and that is agreed by every airline carrier and every airport in Scotland. It is punitive and discriminatory in terms of air passenger duty. Incidentally, another tax where analysis indicates a reduction or indeed an elimination of that tax would result in additional revenue, not less revenue. And therefore, I hope that this Parliament will reiterate its strong support, which is expressed in the past, for air passenger duty coming under the remit of this Parliament. And what a contrast it is between the UK Government and their air passenger duty and their discrimination against Scottish airports and the work of our Transport Minister to secure Inverness's links with London, which has paid off so handsomely in the last few days.
Many thanks. Question 5, Graham Pearson.
To ask the First Minister what steps the Scottish Government is taking to reduce the number of assaults on police officers.
First Minister.
Well, assaults on police officers serve our communities are unacceptable. They will not be tolerated. The Victims and Witnesses Scotland Bill, introduced to the Parliament in February, contains proposals for a new financial penalty, the restitution order. That order will allow courts, for the first time, to make those who assault police officers pay directly towards the services that support police officers who have been assaulted in the course of their duties.
Thanks, Graham Pearson. Briefly, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. No worker in Scotland should go to work anticipating an assault. Crime in Scotland is currently at a 37-year low, but published statistics this month indicate there has been a significant increase in the number of assaults on police officers in the last 37 years, and estimates suggest the increase is over 50%. There needs to be a plan from this Government to reduce the number of assaults on police officers and other workers serving the public. Can we see such a plan?
Minister.
Well, as I've laid out the hope and belief that restitution orders will go some way to that general policy which protects not just police officers but other key public sector workers who put their safety on the line to help the public, to help all of us. Can I say to Graham Pearson, I've been looking very closely at this question of police assaults, particularly the contrast that was made in one of our newspapers between assaults in Scotland and assaults in the Metropolitan Police. And we're actually examining this because I think it's really important to get to the basis of the statistics. The numbers of recorded assaults, common and serious, of police officers in Scotland were currently at 5,555 last year. That's far, far too many. But that does compare, it should be said, with 7,316 in 2006-07. So there has been a downward trend over the last few years. But nonetheless, the contrast between a much lower number of assaults in the Metropolitan Police, I think we have to examine this very carefully to see if it's actually a substantial contrast or whether or not it's a definitional issue. As you know, and as Graham Pearson will certainly know, that we record assaults, both common and serious assaults. We don't define just serious assaults. But I'll be very glad when this analysis is completed, both to arrange for Graham Pearson to have a meeting with the Minister to examine it in more detail and to look at the comprehensive plan we have to protect public service workers against assault.
Okay, question 6, Murdo Fraser.
What action is being taken to address the number of cases of type 2 diabetes?
Minister.
Well, we're maintaining a very strong focus on preventing type 2 diabetes and its complications by trying to address the underlying risk factors. That includes supporting programmes for smoking cessation, for healthy eating, promoting regular exercise, and we're also investing this year to support the implementation of the Diabetes Action Plan, which sets out an ambitious improvement programme for health boards across Scotland.
Murdo Fraser.
The First Minister will be aware that we have an estimated 49,000 people with undiagnosed type 2 diabetes and a further 620,000 at a high risk of developing the condition. This is a ticking time bomb with potentially devastating consequences, both for the health of individuals and for the NHS. Will the First Minister commit his government to fresh, urgent action, and specifically, will he ensure that diabetes is made a national clinical priority?
Minister. Well, I know Further Fraser will know that the National Strategy for Tackling Diabetes Action Plan gives particular focus on the disease. Also, it's worth stressing that the Diabetes Survey, which is the most comprehensive survey of its kind in the world, is also providing valuable information, and each health board is reviewing the survey results and the managed clinical networks, which are the vehicles for improving diabetes services in every single NHS board area across Scotland. It's also worth noting that, in view of recent inward investment decisions, that Scotland will shortly become and host the research and development for diabetes of the whole of the Johnson & Johnson group in the world, which in terms of our life sciences industry and finding ways to monitor and contain the condition and to cure the condition is a fundamental thing that Scotland should be proud of. But make no mistake, that diabetes is very much a priority for this government in terms of the initiatives, and I'm quite certain the Health Minister will be delighted to speak to Murdo Fraser to see if any further initiatives can be planned in terms of tackling this dreadful condition.
Thank you. Dave Stewart, briefly, welcome back.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware that diabetes is the main cause of blindness in those of working age and accounts for half of the non-traumatic lower limb amputations. Will the First Minister support a high-risk, targeted screening regime to find the hundreds of thousands of Scots who suffer from diabetes and don't know it? And will the First Minister join the crusade to eliminate Scotland's silent killer?
Thank you, First Minister.
We'll certainly examine that proposal. Can I add to the welcome back for the member? I should say that Diabetes Survey is the most comprehensive survey of its kind in the world, but no doubt the issue of a screening programme could be further considered. That's actually part of the action plan that's going to the health boards at the present moment. So perhaps the member would like to discuss that matter further with the Health Minister. And I'm sure that the member shares our pride that in his area we have the research and development for diabetes work across the world from Johnson & Johnson in the LifeScan facility.
Thank you, and that concludes questions to the First Minister.